You know, when it comes to fishing walleyes, understanding and using your electronics can be so important. Obviously, electronics have changed a lot, so we're just going to offer a few tips, a few trends that we're seeing as far as optimizing, taking advantage of some of the features that are available today on electronics. Now, basically, you know, the biggest thing is forward-facing sonar. That's changed everything. Now, obviously, side imaging is still really important. 2D sonar is still really important. Even your temperature gauge can be really important. And so, you know, some of these things that we've had for a while, you know, don't dismiss them. You know, we're still using these tools, and if you can learn how to use these tools effectively, there's no doubt in my mind that you're going to catch a lot more walleyes. Now, when it comes to getting good 2D readings, you have a couple different options. You've got a skimmer transducer, you've got 2-in-1 transducers that combine 2D with side imaging. And so when it comes to optimizing and getting the best high speed readings, if it's possible, I don't mind shooting through the hull. If you're using a fiberglass boat with an aluminum boat, that's not an option. And so one thing that I started doing, especially with the longer transducers that have side imaging, I mean, that's just a big transducer. It's really hard to get that transducer set up for good high speed readings. Drop that transducer down, get it below the hull, but then use a tail tamer to knock down the spray and knock down the turbulence. So some of the best high speed readings that I've ever been able to get on an aluminum boat with these big 2-in-1 transducers, use a tail tamer, drop that transducer down. And so that is one thing that we're seeing is transducers get bigger, it's harder to get good readings, especially at higher speeds. Use the tail tamers. The next big trend that's been going on for probably about 3 or 4 years is you combine all these units, especially with forward-facing sonar. Forward-facing sonar draws a lot of power, but if you're running multiple units in your boat using 16-inch screens or bigger, there's a lot of power, and these units require power. If you turn on your unit and it dims when you turn it on, or if you turn on a unit and you turn on a different unit and it dims, that's a power issue. You have to have a good power supply. And so running direct to lithium batteries is a big trend. Not only does it give you the power, but also too, it gives you clean power. And what that means is no interference. And so if you're running off of a cranking battery, for example, or running off of fuse boxes, you're gonna get some interference. And that really seems to affect side imaging in forward-facing sonar in particular. And so what I like to do is use a standalone lithium battery. I'm running a 100 amp hour Norsk Lithium, and I'm running my electronics directly to that battery. And the other thing is make sure that you use a heavy enough gauge wire, 10 gauge wire probably minimum, but use heavier gauge wire and run direct. It's okay to have an inline fuse in your direct wiring to your electronics, but don't run off of blocks or fuse panels. And if you run direct off of a lithium battery without any interference, you're going to get better side imaging and you're going to get a lot better clarity with your forward-facing sonar. You know, and one factor just to be aware of, you know, if you've got your boat inside a shop, you probably have it plugged into your onboard charger where those batteries are charged up all the time. But if you go on a road trip where you're not charged up for a while, there's a couple things in boats today that do draw power, in most notably your foot pedal on your trolling motor. And then if you're running forward-facing sonar, the black box is always drawing off some power even if the units are turned off. And so the other thing that we're starting to see is a lot of people are using switches on their black box for their forward-facing sonar. That way, say if you're driving 8-9 hours to go fish some faraway destination, maybe you're going to be pulled into a hotel parking lot and there's nowhere to plug in, you can turn the power off on that black box. That way it's not drawing off any power. And so power switch on your black box, and then also disconnecting the foot pedal on your trolling motor if you're going to be away from a charging source for a while and you're just going to have to get by with what you have in the batteries. So I'll turn these units on here, and I'm using the HDS 16 for a lot of my forward-facing sonar, and then I'm using a 12 right below it for GPS, side imaging, 2D sonar. So here's a few basic settings for forward-facing sonar. A lot of times I am using it in forward mode. Forward range can vary. Really clear water, spooky fish, I might knock this range out to 80 or 100 feet. As far as downrange, it depends on the depth of water, but basically I just want to level that bottom right along the bottom of the screen. I keep my noise rejection off. On more options, I put stable view. I always have stable view on just to level your screen. And as far as the palette, that can be personal preference. But on the contrast, a lot of times what I like to do is I like to knock it down in the sense that I don't want to have it high where everything is a bright mark. I want to knock that down. That way I can tune out weeds, I can tune out timber. And what I find is by keeping my contrast as low as possible, if it is a big bright mark, it's a big fish. And so for me, it's easier to distinguish the size of fish by keeping my contrast low. And so a lot of times I'll knock that down depending on the water clarity. If you have clear water, you can obviously bump it up. Stained water, turbid water, algae blooms, knock it down. If you have a lot of weeds, knock that down. Now when it comes to GPS and 2D and side imaging, basically with 2D, a lot of times, you know, again, this mode, look at that. There's a general mode, a shallow mode, and a deep mode. If I'm less than 10 feet of water, usually I'm using the shallow mode. If I'm over 20 feet of water, I'm using the deep mode. If I'm in between, I'm using the general mode. But frequency, I like a high chirp. In the color line, again, that can vary. If you're in really clear water, you can crank that power up. If you're in deep water, you can crank that power up. But if you have turbid water, algae blooms, stained water, a lot of times I have to knock that down. Also, too, if you're over a soft bottom, I find that I have to knock that down as far as just getting rid of the clutter on the screen. And one more thing that I like to do, you go under more options, and as far as your palette, I like to use this color palette 13. It shows the bottom is brown, but what I really like about color palette 13 is it's easier to distinguish the size of the fish, in the sense if you have a bigger walleye, for example, let's say over 22 inches, you're going to get some green in the mark. And when you go into the advanced menu, you've got noise rejection. Again, I keep that low unless there's a lot of algae in the water or it's turbid water where I'm just getting clutter on the screen. Scroll speed, a lot of times I'm keeping that normal, but if I'm trying to get really good high speed readings to try to see suspended fish, for example, I'll knock that up. Ping speed, I always keep that at max. Now when it comes to side imaging, you've got two frequencies. You've got 1075, you got 455. As a rule of thumb, your 1075 is going to be much better readings at, say, out to say 60, 70 feet, especially in, say, 7 to 20 feet of water, and you're going to get a lot more detail, a lot more definition. And so for seeing fish, a lot of times I like to use the 1075 frequency. But in deeper water at further ranges, the 455 is going to give you a lot more. And so if I'm trying to find brush piles, rock piles, if I'm trying to find structure with the side imaging, especially over deeper water, I'm using the 455. If I'm trying to find fish as a rule of thumb, I'm using the 1075. I've seen some exceptions to that. There are some situations in less than, say, 7 feet of water where I find that for whatever reason I can see fish better with the 455 than the 1075 in extremely shallow water. And as far as contrast, you can tune that out. Palette, that's personal preference, but basically just adjust your settings so you can see the best picture. You'll know it when you see it, in the sense that if you're getting good clarity, good sharp readings on the bottom, that's how you know that your side imaging is set up. And so what I encourage people to do is drive over bottoms, drive through areas where you have some familiarity, even if it's a boat dock, a rock pile at the end of the boat ramp, whatever it is. Drive by something where you know there's rocks, where you know that there's a certain type of bottom, and then you can tweak your settings so that you get the best picture. One final tip with side imaging in particular is that sometimes the angle of the transducer can have a big bearing on your side imaging readings. And so as a rule of thumb, when the boat's on the trailer, the boat's level. When the boat's in the water, the bow's going to be sticking up higher than the back of the boat, and that'll push your transducer at a down angle. And so a lot of times you just lift the transducer up, just angle it up off the back, and it seems like that keeps it more level when the boat's floating in the water, and that seems to influence side imaging, where you get better side imaging readings by angling that transducer up. So one thing I like to do with the GPS is color code the depth contours. I find that it's just easier to find and locate structure. It's easier to put together a pattern where everything just jumps out at you. It's easier to navigate. And so I keep my shallow red, which is 0 to 5, and then maybe 5 to 10 orange, 10 to 15 yellow, 15 to 20 green, and just color code your depth contours. That way structure becomes a lot more obvious when you're fishing a lake. One final tip is, Get strategic with managing your waypoints. You know, you can use different symbols. You know, I might have a specific symbol for weeds. I might have a specific symbol for a rock pile. I might have a specific symbol for the very top of a hump that's not on the map. If I catch fish, I'm going to use maybe just a round circle symbol, but I'll have different colors that I'll use for different size fish. And so say fish less than 20 inches, I might use blue. Mid-sized fish, I might use green. Big fish, I might use red, just so that I can organize and remember what those waypoints mean. And so weeds, I use a specific symbol, rocks, and so on. But manage your waypoints as you go. That way it's going to make a lot more sense, especially 5-6 months down the road.